Before she could reach her table, a wealthy family blocked her path. One sharp slap echoed across the room. The matriarch's voice cut through the music with a coldness that silenced even the string quartet in the corner. "People like you don't belong here," she said, and the words landed like a verdict. The room froze. No one defended the woman who stood at the center of it. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. No one in that grand hall knew that the woman they had just humiliated was the CEO whose signature would determine whether a $1 billion acquisition moved forward or dissolved entirely. 30 seconds later, one phone call changed everything, and the family who raised their hand against her watched their fortune begin to disappear. At the most exclusive charity gala in Atlanta, billionaire guests arrived in columns of polished black cars, their heels clicking against imported marble, their laughter rising above the orchestra like something practiced and deliberate. The chandeliers threw gold light across silk gowns and tailored tuxedos. The air smelled of champagne and money, of deals spoken quietly in corners and favors exchanged between men who had never in their lives stood in a line. It was the kind of room where power wore a pleasant face, where old names were currency and new names were provisional, where what you owned mattered, but what your family had owned for 3 generations mattered more. The waitstaff moved through it in quiet orbits, trained to be invisible, trained to read the invisible gradations of who required more attention and who required less. The guests moved through it in louder ones, conscious of being watched and content to be, because being seen in this room was itself a kind of confirmation. Somewhere beneath the chandeliers and the silk and the orchestrated warmth of an evening, organized for appearance, where fortunes were built not over years but over one carefully arranged evening, a contract worth $1 billion waited for a single signature. Maya Brooks did not live the way people assumed she did. She was 42 years old, and if you passed her on the street, you might notice the quiet confidence in her posture, the way she moved without hurry and without apology, but you would not immediately guess what she had built. She was not the kind of woman who filled a room with noise before she entered it. She was the kind of woman who sat down and listened until she understood something completely, and then she spoke, and when she did, the words had the quality of things that had been tested thoroughly before being released. People who had worked with her for years described the experience in similar terms. You never felt managed by her, you felt considered, and the distinction mattered more than they could always articulate. She did not wear her wealth like armor. She did not require the room to know her name before she entered it. Her mornings began before sunrise in a modest office on the 14th floor of a building she owned outright, where she drank black coffee and reviewed reports with the same steady focus she had applied to every decision since the age of 24, when she had taken a $20,000 loan from a community bank in Memphis and built the first iteration of what would eventually become Apex Meridian Technologies, a firm now valued at just under $40 billion. She had not inherited a single dollar of it. She had not married into it. She had not been handed access or connections or the comfortable runway of generational wealth. She had worked and thought and failed in ways that would have ended lesser ambitions, and rebuilt and worked again, staying later than anyone else in the building and arriving earlier, not because she needed to perform effort, but because the work itself demanded it, because she had built something from nothing, and she understood better than anyone that the distance between nothing and something is not talent, it is accumulated decision, thousands of small correct choices made in rooms where no one is watching, laid down like stones across a gap that most people never attempt to cross. She had worked until the company was something that even her most skeptical competitors could not dismiss. She kept no publicist on retainer. She declined most interview requests. She appeared on magazine covers only when the publication agreed in advance to focus on the company's work rather than her personal story, because she believed that the story of one woman's success, while meaningful, was less important than the systems that could allow thousands of women like her to build something of their own. Her board admired this quality. Her legal team sometimes found it maddening, particularly in the moments when a carefully placed profile piece might have smoothed a regulatory review or softened a difficult quarter's coverage. But Maya had looked, over 2 decades in business, at the founders and executives who had optimized for reputation and watched several of them discover that reputation, managed as a primary concern, becomes fragile in ways that the underlying work does not. She preferred the underlying work. She trusted it more. It was not an affectation. It was a principle she had held since the beginning, when she had watched other founders lose themselves in the spectacle of being successful rather than the discipline of staying that way. She had no interest in spectacle. She had an interest in outcomes. And outcomes, she had found, had a way of producing their own recognition on a timeline that could not be rushed, but also could not be permanently stopped. The invitation to the gala had come through her chief of staff 3 weeks earlier. It was a charity event, technically, organized to raise funding for educational programs in underserved communities across Georgia, a cause Maya cared about personally and supported through a separate foundation she had funded quietly for the past decade, a foundation that had provided college scholarships to over 300 young women from low-income households in the years since its founding, none of whom had ever been told who the donor was, because Maya had insisted on anonymity as a condition of every gift. The giving was not for recognition. The giving was because she remembered being 22 and calculating whether she could afford both textbooks and groceries, and choosing the textbooks and eating less. And she did not want the next generation of women who thought the way she thought and worked the way she worked to have to make that calculation. But the evening also served a second purpose, one that only a small circle of people knew about. It was to be the final social setting before the formal signing of a landmark acquisition agreement between Apex Meridian and a legacy manufacturing firm, a deal that had been in negotiation for 11 months and that, if completed, would restructure an entire sector of the regional economy. The event's host had offered the occasion as a neutral and elegant venue for both parties to confirm their commitment before the papers were drawn. Maya had agreed because she respected the gesture, and because she believed that the human dimension of a business relationship mattered, that the way people conducted themselves outside the conference room said something true about who they were inside it. She had learned this lesson early and at some cost from a partnership in her late 20s that had looked impeccable on paper and had failed spectacularly in practice because the people involved had treated their employees as a resource rather than a constituency, and Maya had decided then that she would never again separate a person's business character from their human one, because in the end, they were the same character operating in different rooms. She had arrived without an entourage. She wore a deep navy gown, understated in cut, but exceptional in fabric, the kind of dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but gave no outward indication of this. A single piece of jewelry at her collarbone, no dramatic entrance. She stepped through the main doors of the Grand Harrington Hotel at 7:43 in the evening and was immediately aware of the assessment happening around her. Eyes moved to her face and then away. A woman near the coat check smiled politely, but did not hold the expression long enough to mean anything. A pair of men in the far corner tracked her movement toward the VIP section without moving their heads. A server offered her a glass of champagne, and she accepted it and held it without drinking, moving through the room with the particular ease of someone who is comfortable being underestimated, who has learned over decades that the space people leave around you when they have decided you are unremarkable is actually the most useful space in any room, because in it you can observe everything while no one is observing you. Maya had spent her entire adult life entering rooms where people were deciding what category to place her in before she had spoken a word, and she had long since stopped finding it surprising. She simply moved forward, as she always did, and waited for the room to catch up. The Whitmore family had occupied Atlanta's upper tier of society for 3 generations, which in their estimation meant something permanent, something that could not be acquired or replicated by anyone who had not grown into it from birth. Richard Whitmore was 61 years old, the son of a man who had built a regional industrial firm in the 1980s on the strength of government contracts and fortuitously timed real estate acquisitions. Richard had inherited the company at 38 after his father's death and had expanded it modestly in the years that followed, riding the infrastructure growth of the early 2000s and keeping the firm profitable through a combination of conservative management and the kind of political connections that came with 3 decades of charitable gala attendance board memberships, and alumni association donations to the right institutions. He was not a visionary, he was a steward, and for a long time, that had been enough. He had been told by enough people, over enough years, that stewardship was itself a form of excellence, that maintaining what your father built was a worthy inheritance of its own. And he had come to believe it with the comfortable certainty of a man who has never had to interrogate a belief in order to hold it. He sat on 4 corporate boards. He gave appropriately sized donations to appropriately selected charities. He had shaken the right hands at the right moments for 30 years, and the result was a social position that felt, from inside it, like the natural outcome of good judgment. But the past 4 years had not been kind to Whitmore Industries. Supply chain disruptions had eaten into margins. A failed expansion into a new manufacturing segment had consumed capital that should have been held in reserve. 2 key contracts with state agencies had not been renewed. The firm's debt load had grown quietly, and then loudly, and then in a way that required a solution rather than a management plan. The $1 billion acquisition offer from Apex Meridian was not simply a business opportunity. It was the difference between the Whitmore family retaining meaningful control of the firm their grandfather had built and watching it dissolve through a series of increasingly desperate restructurings. Richard knew this. His legal counsel knew this. His CFO knew this. And yet the knowledge had not fundamentally altered how Richard moved through rooms or how he assessed the people in them, because for Richard, the crisis was financial, and the financial could be solved, and the social certainty that underpinned everything else remained, in his estimation, exactly where it had always been. The only person in the room who seemed not to fully grasp the gravity of their position, the one whose behavior might have revealed most clearly the depth of the family's miscalculation, was Victoria Whitmore. Victoria was 58 years old and had been the defining social presence of her family's public life for as long as anyone in Atlanta's charitable circuit could remember. She sat on the boards of 4 cultural institutions. She had chaired the Gala's planning committee for 6 of the past 9 years. She knew which families had old money, and which had new money, and which had money that came from places best left unspoken, and she calibrated her warmth accordingly, distributing attention and acknowledgement the way a sovereign distributes favor, as a signal rather than a gift. She had opinions about everything that mattered in the room she occupied, and the opinions were always delivered with a confidence that precluded revision. She knew the right caterers and the wrong ones. She knew which philanthropies were credible and which were social performance. She knew the precise gradations of dress that communicated genuine wealth versus its imitation, and she prided herself on reading a room correctly within minutes of entering it. She had done this for 30 years and had been wrong rarely enough that the errors had not accumulated into a pattern she needed to address. She believed, with the sincere and unexamined conviction of someone who had never been forced to question it, that society had a natural order, and that her role within that order was both deserved and self-evident. She did not think of herself as prejudiced. She thought of herself as discerning. The distinction, to her, was real. To the woman in the navy dress approaching the VIP section, it was not. When she noticed the woman in the navy dress moving toward the VIP section, her first instinct was administrative. The VIP section was not open to general attendees. It had a separate list. She had helped design the seating arrangement herself. The woman moving toward it did not appear on any face she recognized, which meant either an error had been made somewhere in the registration process, or someone had arrived without proper credentials. Victoria set down her champagne flute with the quiet deliberateness of someone accustomed to being correct and moved to intercept. Maya had nearly reached the 3rd table from the front when the woman stepped into her path. The gesture was not aggressive in form, simply a planted presence, a body inserted between one point and another. Maya stopped. She looked at the woman without alarm. She waited. Victoria tilted her head with the practiced patience of someone who had spent decades making social corrections without raising her voice. "May I see your invitation, please?" she asked. The words were polite in structure, but not in tone. They carried within them a prior conclusion, the assumption that the answer would confirm what Victoria had already decided. Maya reached into the small clutch she carried and produced a cream-colored card. Victoria took it, examined it briefly, and returned it without acknowledgement. "These events are ticketed," she said. "It's not about the card. It's about whether you're on the list." Maya explained, quietly and without irritation, that her name was on the primary guest list, that she had confirmed her attendance 2 weeks prior, and that if there was any question, the event coordinator would be able to confirm it immediately. Victoria's expression did not change. She asked Maya to step aside while she verified. Maya said she was happy to wait, but saw no reason to step away from the table she had been assigned. And something in that response, the calm refusal to accommodate a request that was not reasonable, the steady eye contact that did not flinch or apologize, shifted something in Victoria's composure. The conversation escalated in the way these things do when one person has decided on an outcome and another person declines to cooperate with it. Victoria's voice did not rise dramatically, but it gained an edge. She gestured toward the entrance and said that guests who had concerns about their seating should direct them to staff. Maya said, again without emotion, that she was not a guest with a concern. She was a guest with a seat. Victoria reached out and took hold of Maya's forearm, not violently but firmly, the grip of a woman who expected the physical gesture to complete what the words had not. Maya looked down at the hand on her arm and then back up. "Please let go of me," she said. Her voice was steady. It did not tremble. It was not a question. What happened in the next 3 seconds was witnessed by approximately 40 people in the immediate vicinity and caught on the phones of at least 7. Victoria released Maya's arm, and then, in a motion that seemed to arrive from somewhere deeper than the moment, from some reservoir of affronted certainty, she raised her hand and brought it across Maya's cheek. The sound was sharp and small and enormous, all at once. It struck the air out of every nearby conversation. The quartet had moved between pieces, and the silence they left behind made the impact ring like something official. Every head within 30 feet turned. No one moved, no one spoke. No one who was present in that moment would be entirely able to explain afterward why they did not act, except to say that they were stunned, and that by the time the stunning had passed, something had already shifted in the room that made intervention feel beside the point. Maya stood completely still. She touched her cheek with 2 fingers, not a gesture of distress, but something almost clinical, as if she were confirming a fact. Her expression did not fracture. There was no visible anger. There was no visible hurt. She had been in rooms, over the course of her life and career, where things had been done to her and said about her that she had not deserved, and she had learned the discipline of not spending the moment of impact on a reaction, because a reaction in those moments costs you the one thing you have that the other person does not, which is clarity. She had learned to receive a blow and hold it, not suppress it, but contain it. The way you contain something valuable, carefully, so that it does not get wasted. There was only a stillness that was somehow more unsettling to the witnesses than any reaction would have been, because it suggested a person who had not been broken by the moment, but had instead placed it somewhere precise and intentional inside herself, where it would be used rather than wasted. Some of the guests nearest to her looked away. Some took out their phones, without fully deciding to. A server who had been approaching the table stopped 10 feet away and did not come closer. The person standing at the center of the stillness did not move. She did not look around for someone to confirm what had happened. She did not search the faces of the witnesses for solidarity or sympathy. She simply stood in the exact spot where the impact had occurred and breathed and let the room absorb what it had just done. Victoria, having completed the action, seemed briefly to expect something in return, some collapse or retreat or vocal acknowledgement that she had imposed order. When none came, she smoothed the front of her gown with one hand and turned slightly away, as if the matter had concluded. Her husband appeared at her elbow moments later, having navigated toward the sound from the other side of the room. He listened to her brief account with his head slightly lowered. He said, quietly but audibly enough for 2 or 3 people to hear, that she had probably handled it correctly, that events like this required someone willing to maintain standards. Maya heard this. She gave no indication that she had. She remained where she was for another moment, in the precise spot where the impact had occurred, as if moving from it would suggest she had been displaced. Then she reached into her clutch and retrieved her phone. She did not raise her voice. She did not look for witnesses or seek validation from the people around her who were now watching her with a mixture of discomfort and something they could not quite name. She made a call, and the call lasted less than 20 seconds. And the only words anyone nearby could make out were brief and final. Cancel the meeting. That was all. She ended the call and placed the phone back into her clutch. She walked to her assigned seat and sat down. She picked up the menu card and read it as though she were considering her options for the evening ahead. 3 floors above the ballroom, in a suite that Apex Meridian's legal team had reserved for the duration of the evening, the call was received by Maya's general counsel, a man named David Hargrove, who had worked with her for 9 years and who understood, from the tone and the brevity of the instruction, that the decision was final and not a prelude to negotiation. He had worked with Maya long enough to know the difference between her voice when she was considering something and her voice when she had already considered it. He did not ask for an explanation. He did not suggest a pause to reconsider. He recognized the instruction for what it was, a decision made by someone who had weighed the matter fully and was not interested in having the weight redistributed. He made 2 calls within the next 4 minutes. The first was to the lead attorney coordinating the acquisition documentation. The second was to a senior executive at Meridian Capital, the financial partner backing the deal from the buyer's side. Both conversations were short. Both ended with the same result. The term sheet was formally paused. The signing session scheduled for the following morning at 9 o'clock was canceled. All parties were to be notified by end of evening. The deal, which had survived 11 months of complex negotiation, due diligence reviews, regulatory consultation, and the kind of patient structural work that only the most experienced dealmakers could sustain, which had required the goodwill and persistent effort of more than 40 professionals across multiple firms, which had been, until 70 minutes ago, the most certain thing on the calendar of every person connected to it, was gone. Not delayed. Not reconsidered. Gone. The Whitmore family was not immediately aware of this. Richard was at the bar with 2 associates from the banking sector, discussing the morning's schedule with the mild pleasure of a man who believed the difficult part was already behind him. Victoria had rejoined a cluster of women near the floral installation, accepting a refreshed glass of wine and describing the earlier incident to them in the satisfied tone of someone who had just resolved an administrative inconvenience. Their son, James Whitmore, 29 years old and nominally listed as a junior executive at the firm, was in a conversation near the terrace that had nothing to do with business. The family moved through the first hour of the gala with the ease of people who believed themselves securely located within the world they had always occupied. The first sign that something had changed came from an unexpected direction. A man named Gerald Pierce, who served on the finance committee of the consortium backing the Whitmore acquisition, stepped away from a conversation near the back of the room after receiving a message on his phone. His face, which had been composed and pleasantly social all evening, underwent a change that people near him noticed without understanding. He excused himself and moved quickly through the crowd toward the bar where Richard was standing. He touched Richard's elbow. He leaned in. He said 3 words that Richard would replay in his memory for years afterward. The deal's gone. Richard laughed first, the brief, involuntary laugh of someone who has misheard something and expects the correction to be immediate. Then he looked at Gerald's expression and stopped laughing. He asked what he meant. Gerald told him that the acquisition agreement had been formally paused as of 11 minutes ago, that the signing session had been canceled, and that the instruction had come from the CEO of the acquiring firm directly, by phone, from inside this building, during this event, within the last 20 minutes. Richard set down his glass. He asked who the CEO of the acquiring firm was. Gerald looked at him for a moment. Then he said the name, Maya Brooks. Richard's awareness of what had happened assembled itself slowly, the way the full significance of a collision takes time to arrive after the impact. He had been told, in the weeks leading up to this evening, that the final approval rested with the acquiring firm's CEO, a person whose name he had seen on documents, but whose face he had never connected to a person in a room. He had assumed, because he had never been given a reason not to assume that this person would be represented tonight by counsel or a senior delegate, that CEOs of that magnitude did not typically attend events like this unaccompanied. He had formed, somewhere in the months of preparation, a mental image of this CEO that was assembled from the reputation and the deal structure and the way her team communicated. And the image had certain qualities, a certain configuration of authority and presence, and the woman in the navy dress who had stood alone in the doorway had not matched it, not because Maya had done anything to disguise herself, but because Richard's imagination had built something out of assumption rather than evidence. This was the most honest and devastating thing the evening had revealed to him. Not that his wife had made an error, but that he had made it first, silently and completely, before his wife had ever crossed the room. The idea that the woman in the navy dress, the woman his wife had stopped and questioned and ultimately struck, was the person on whom the entire future of Whitmore Industries now depended, arrived in Richard's mind not as a dramatic revelation, but as something slower and colder and more precise. He turned and looked across the ballroom toward the main tables at the front. He could see her from where he stood, seated, upright, entirely composed, reading something on her phone with the unhurried manner of a person who had nowhere better to be and nothing left to prove. A board member from the acquiring company's consortium recognized her first among the wider group. He was speaking to a colleague near the dessert station when he noticed Maya seated at the primary guest table and went very still. He turned to the colleague, who was also connected to the deal. He said, in a voice from which all pretense of ease had been drained, "Do you know who that is?" The colleague looked. They both looked. Then the colleague walked directly to where Gerald Pierce was standing with Richard Whitmore, and the circle of understanding widened. Victoria was summoned from her conversation across the room. She arrived at her husband's side with the air of a woman who expected to be told something manageable. What she was told instead was something her mind required several full seconds to process, not because the information was complicated, but because accepting it required a revision of a certainty she had held since the moment she had crossed the ballroom to intercept the woman in the navy dress. She had assumed the woman did not belong. She had assumed the woman was in the wrong place. She had assumed, from something she would not have named directly, that the woman in the navy gown was less than the room she had entered, that her presence required explanation, and her comfort did not require consideration. She had been wrong in a way that was not simply factual but structural wrong, not about this one specific person's identity, but about the entire framework she had used to assess the situation. Wrong in a way that, had she been capable of fully meeting it in that moment, might have opened into something genuinely instructive. But the first emotion that reached her face was not remorse. It was a whitening, a loss of color that suggested not understanding, but fear. Richard moved across the ballroom with the desperate purposefulness of a man running toward a consequence he cannot outpace. He had rehearsed something in his head during the 30 seconds it took him to cross the room, a sequence of phrases designed to convey humility while preserving the possibility that the situation might still be retrievable, that some adequate acknowledgement of the error might open a door that had not yet fully closed. He reached Maya's table and stood at its edge. He cleared his throat. He said her name, formally, with the full weight of its professional significance, as though using it correctly now might compensate for having not known it an hour ago. He said that he needed to apologize, that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that his wife had been in the wrong place and had acted without the benefit of proper information. The words came out in a shape that resembled an apology, but carried within them a frame that was not quite right, the suggestion that the problem had been one of misidentification rather than behavior, that if only the correct information had been available, the interaction would have gone differently. It was the apology of a man apologizing for the outcome rather than for the action, for the fact that the woman turned out to matter rather than for the fact that she had been treated as though she did not. Maya looked at him without expression. She did not stand. She did not invite him to sit. She simply let the words arrive and settle, and then she spoke. She said that she understood what he was trying to communicate. She said that she did not doubt that he believed the apology to be genuine. She said that the physical act itself, though it was serious and would be addressed through appropriate channels, was not actually the central issue. She said it quietly and clearly, in a tone that was not unkind but left no room for negotiation. The central issue, she explained, was not that his wife had made a mistake about who Maya was. The central issue was that his wife had treated a stranger, a person whose identity and status were completely unknown to her, with contempt and then with violence. She said that the behavior had not been the result of mistaken identity. It had been the result of a judgment about what kind of person was worth decent treatment. She said that if that was the character of the family's leadership, she could not in good conscience build a partnership of any kind on that foundation, because foundations are revealed not in the boardroom, but in the moments when no one important appears to be watching. Victoria had followed her husband across the room and stood a few feet behind him, listening. She attempted once to insert a clarification, a sentence that began with the words, "What you have to understand." Maya looked at her briefly and returned her attention to Richard. Around them, the circle of eavesdroppers had widened. Guests who had been pretending not to listen were no longer pretending. The string quartet was playing something low and ambient, but the music had lost its ability to provide cover. Maya finished what she had to say with a single sentence that was delivered not for the room, but for Richard specifically, in the tone of someone stating a policy that had already been put into effect. "If this is how you treat strangers," she said, "I cannot trust you with $1 billion partnership." Then she looked back down at the menu card on the table in front of her, and the conversation was over. The formal consequences began arriving before midnight. The legal team for Meridian Capital sent a notice to Whitmore Industries Counsel confirming the suspension of the term sheet and withdrawing the offer of acquisition pending an unspecified review. The banking consortium that had been prepared to finance a portion of the deal notified its partners by morning that it was revisiting its position. By the following afternoon, the story had moved through the private communications of enough people in Atlanta's business and finance community that it had the character of something already known rather than newly discovered, a thing that people referenced with the confidence of those who had been present, even when they had only been told. Some of those who had actually been present at the gala confirmed the basic facts when asked. One or two of the phone recordings circulated in limited fashion. None of this was coordinated by Maya or anyone connected to her. It simply moved the way true things move in small and concentrated circles. Not because anyone pushed it, but because it had the weight of something that resisted compression, a fact too concrete to be softened into rumor. By the morning of the second day, the story had reached two business journalists who covered Atlanta's corporate sector. Neither published anything immediately. They made calls. They confirmed sources. They asked for comment. Whitmore Industries' communications team, caught without a prepared response for a situation their crisis plan had not anticipated, issued a statement describing the evening's events as a personal misunderstanding between private individuals and emphasizing that the firm remained committed to finding strong partnership opportunities. The statement did not use the word slap. It did not mention Maya by name. It did not work. Two institutional investors contacted the firm's investor relations department within 36 hours to ask questions whose subtext was clear even when the words remained professionally measured. The firm's board convened an emergency call on the morning of the third day. The tone of that call, by the accounts of two people who were present for it, was unlike anything the board had experienced in a decade of quarterly reviews. Richard spent the 72 hours following the gala in a state that those who knew him well would later describe as something adjacent to grief, not for the lost deal specifically, though the financial implications were severe, but for the version of himself and his family that the night had permanently reclassified. He had believed, without ever quite articulating it, that the family's position in Atlanta's social and business landscape was the product of merit and longevity in equal measure, that they had earned their standing not only through inheritance, but through the quality of their conduct. He had sat in rooms for 30 years, listening to people describe his family as pillars, as examples, as the kind of institution the city had built itself around, and he had received those descriptions, the way you receive any truth you have never been given reason to question. gratefully and without examination. The gala had not simply cost him a contract. It had cost him a story he had told himself for 61 years. And it had done so in a room full of people who had also heard that story and who were now, quietly and irrevocably, revising it. The stock implications were direct and unwelcome. Whitmore Industries was publicly traded on a regional exchange, and while its share price had been under pressure for months, the withdrawal of the Apex Meridian acquisition sent it to a level that triggered automatic reviews by two institutional holders. Within a week, one of the firm's largest institutional shareholders reduced its position. The CFO delivered a report to the board that was candid in ways that earlier reports had managed to avoid being. The firm would need to explore alternative restructuring paths. The paths available to them were narrower and less favorable than the one that had been withdrawn. Victoria did not speak publicly about what had happened, but those who knew her reported that the silence was not peace. She had built an identity on the certainty of her own discernment, on the belief that her judgments about people and situations were accurate and appropriate, and that accuracy had collapsed in a single evening in a way that no private recalibration could fully address. She had been wrong, and she had been wrong in front of everyone, and the wrongness had not been small or abstract. It had cost her family its future in the most concrete possible terms. She was not, by any account, a woman incapable of reflection. But reflection requires a willingness to look directly at the thing you have done rather than at the circumstances that preceded it, and that willingness arrives on its own schedule, in its own time, and sometimes not at all. What Victoria experienced in the weeks and months following the gala was more accurately described as reckoning than reflection, the slow, unwilling encounter with the fact that the certainty she had trusted had been wrong in a way that mattered, and that the price of that wrongness had been paid not only by her family, but by a woman who had done nothing to deserve it, except be present in a room where someone had already decided what she was. Maya addressed the events briefly. Once, in a meeting with her senior leadership team approximately 10 days after the gala, she did not dramatize it. She did not frame it as a victory. She did not use the occasion to make a statement about broader inequities, though the inequities were real and she was aware of them, because she believed that the primary audience for that conversation was not her leadership team but herself, and she had already had it privately, in the hour after the gala, when she had driven home in the dark, with her phone face down on the passenger seat, and allowed herself to feel everything she had not permitted herself to feel in the ballroom. She said only that the evaluation of a potential partner is never limited to financial documentation, and that character reveals itself when no one important appears to be watching. She said that the decision to withdraw from the agreement had not been impulsive, but had been consistent with the standards she expected of every partnership the company entered. Standards she had articulated in the company's operating principles from the beginning, and had never had reason to invoke quite so directly. She thanked the team for their work on the 11 months of preparation, acknowledged that the effort had been substantial and the result disappointing, and asked them to identify the next candidate. Then she moved on to the following agenda item, and the meeting continued. Several months later, Apex Meridian completed a different acquisition in the same sector, a smaller firm with less historical prestige but more internal coherence, whose leadership team, Maya, had evaluated over 3 in-person meetings and found to be people she could work with over time, people who treated their subordinates with the same respect they brought to a boardroom, people who told you a hard truth directly, rather than dressing it in civility. The deal closed without ceremony. There was no gala. There was no grand ballroom. There was a conference room on the 3rd floor of a building in Marietta, a signed set of documents, a brief handshake, and then everyone returned to the work. The integration went well. The firm's quarterly reports in the year that followed reflected the benefit of it, and Maya read those reports each quarter with the particular satisfaction of someone who had built something real on a foundation she had chosen carefully rather than accepted by default. Whitmore Industries completed a restructuring that was, by all external accounts, handled competently under the circumstances, though the terms were significantly less favorable than those the Apex Meridian offer would have provided. The family retained nominal control of the firm, but at a reduced ownership percentage and with a new board structure that limited their unilateral authority. Richard made several public appearances in the months following, in which he said the right things about the firm's resilience and future direction. He was believed by some. There was a final meeting between Richard Whitmore and Maya Brooks, arranged through mutual professional contacts approximately 8 months after the gala, in a conference room at a neutral law office in Midtown Atlanta. Richard had requested it. He had said, through the intermediary, that he wanted only to speak with her directly, without legal agenda, without any expectation of a business outcome. Maya had agreed because she believed in closure and did not believe in unnecessary distance between people who had been consequentially connected, and because she had learned that unfinished conversations have a way of occupying space in your attention that could be used more productively. She was not afraid of the meeting. She was not angry going into it. She was simply present, the way she was present for every meeting that required her full attention, which was every meeting she agreed to take. They sat across from each other at a small table. There was water. There was no one else in the room. The absence of lawyers and intermediaries was something Richard had specifically requested, and Maya had respected the request because she understood that he was trying to say something that could only be said without an audience, and she was willing to give him the space to say it. Richard said that he had spent 8 months trying to understand what had happened and what he should have done differently, not only that evening but in the years before it, in the habits of thought and the patterns of assumption that had made it possible for his wife to act the way she had and for him to briefly defend her. He said that he wished they had met under different circumstances. He said it plainly, without performance. It was the most honest thing Maya had heard from him. Maya looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "We did meet correctly. Your family simply showed me the truth." She said it without malice and without satisfaction. She said it the way a person states something they have thought about carefully and arrived at honestly. Richard nodded. He did not argue with it. They sat quietly for a moment, in the way that people sometimes sit when everything that needed to be said has been said, and the remaining time is simply acknowledgement. Then Maya stood. She extended her hand. He shook it. She collected her folio from the table and walked out of the room, through the corridor, and into the elevator, and out of the building into the September afternoon light, where the city moved around her in its ordinary way, indifferent and continuous and full of the next thing. She did not celebrate what had happened to the Whitmore family. She took no particular satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, because the goal had never been to reduce them. The goal had been to protect something she had built over 20 years from the corrosive influence of people who did not understand that power was not the same as character, that money was not the same as integrity, that the confidence to slap a stranger in a ballroom full of witnesses was not strength, but its precise opposite. She had seen enough of the world to know that institutions built on contempt eventually collapsed under their own weight. She had not needed to collapse the Whitmores. She had only needed to step back and allow the structure they had built to bear what it could not bear. The slap had lasted 1 second. She had felt it in the moment. The sharpness of it, the indignity, the public nature of the thing, the particular quality of being harmed in a room full of people who chose not to see it. There was a specific texture to that kind of harm. When it happens in plain sight and the witnesses organize themselves around their own discomfort rather than yours, when you are simultaneously at the center of the room and entirely alone in it, she had felt all of it, and she had held it, and she had converted it into a decision that took 11 months of work, and placed it with careful precision in a moment when its weight was exactly correct. She had not wasted it on anger. She had not wasted it on a scene. She had simply understood, with the clarity that comes from a lifetime of being underestimated, that the most powerful thing she could do was to remain exactly who she was and allow the room to discover, in its own time, what that meant. She had built a company worth $40 billion by understanding that the work speaks last and longest, that the people who dismiss you loudest at the beginning are often the ones who have to account for you most thoroughly in the end, and that the only response to being told you do not belong in a room is to keep building until the room is yours. She walked back to the office that afternoon and worked until 7. She had a meeting at 8 the following morning that she was looking forward to. There were things to build. There were always things to build. She had spent 20 years understanding that the work itself was the answer to every question about whether she deserved to be in the room, and she had no intention of stopping now. The gala would become, in time, a story people told in business school, an illustration of something about character and consequence that professors would use to make a point about the hidden costs of contempt. Maya would not be the one telling it. She did not need to. The facts had their own momentum, and she had learned long ago that the most powerful thing you can do in a world that underestimates you is not to fight the underestimation, but to outlast it, to build something so clearly real, so plainly substantial, that eventually even the people who most wanted to dismiss it could not find the vocabulary to do so. That was what she had built. That was what she continued to build. And the woman who had been slapped in a ballroom in front of 40 witnesses was the same woman who had built a $40 billion company from a $20,000 loan, which meant she already knew what she needed to know about how things begin and what they can become and who decides.